The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Hi, I'm Sonya Peral from 9 Pin Cider Works in Albany, New York, and this is New York Cider. Our purpose is to educate our viewers about New York cider and New York apples. Today we're delighted to have Professor Emeritus from Cornell, Ian Merwin, who is also the owner of Black Diamond Farm. He makes excellent cider, and he's a board member of the New York State Cider Association. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Let's start to discuss cider and apples regionally, and then we'll hone down to New York. Why was cider so important historically in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions of the United States?
So at that time, so we're going back to the late 1600s, 1700s, almost everybody was a farmer, and every farm had an orchard. And the product that you could make from the apples in those orchards was basically cider. They weren't really so much for fresh fruit. They were for making cider. And it was sort of the perfect food for people then, because they could harvest fruit from those apples. Have a very long harvest window starting in August and going through to the middle of November. So you had sustained harvest of fresh fruit, which you could do all sorts of great cooking sorts of things with, and the fruit that was blemished or not something you would want to eat out of hand was perfect for cider. So they would press it. Actually, if you looked at a map of New England and the Mid-Atlantic states a couple hundred years ago, about every 8 to 10 miles there was a cider mill. So the farms could put the fruit in a wagon, take it to the cider mill, get it pressed, put it in barrels, and be home with a horse and buggy before dark. So you need a lot of cider mills. And then you could roll those barrels down into the cellar. Of course, everybody had cellars in those days. And cider will just naturally ferment because there's yeast on the fruit and usually floated in the air. There's yeast as we speak. And so it would go through a kind of a slow fermentation in the cellar. And beginning around Christmas time, they would have alcoholic or hard, or what I'm going to just call cider. So when I say cider, I'm talking about the fermented stuff, not the sweet stuff. So they would have that for the winter. It has a little bit of vitamin C in it. It has calories, and it's naturally preserved by the ethanol, the alcohol. Typical cider, most apples are going to be between about 12% and 15 or 16% sugar, and if you divide that in half, that's how much alcohol you'll end up with in the cider. So it was naturally preserved. It's a low pH product, so it was very stable. And they could start drinking cider out of that barrel. And then as they would be tapping the barrel and you'd get more and more oxygen in the headspace, there's also always acetobacter around, and acetobacter could take the ethanol and turn it into cider vinegar. And cider vinegar was a really important way that people had of preserving food, like sauerkraut and pickles. And so sort of at every stage, they got something that was usable from a raw product that they had on the farm. And if you were traveling in that era, there were no municipal water supplies. There was not a lot of good sanitation. And so chances are, if you were away from your home and you went to a tavern or a restaurant, you really wouldn't want to drink a glass of water, because it would be, you could get typhoid or cholera or God knows what else. Whereas you could only drink the beer or the cider because there's enough alcohol in there to kill bacteria that might make you sick.
So it really provided a complete ecosystem, food system for the earlier settlers.
It was the whole thing, yeah.
That's pretty interesting. So now New York is a leading state for cider, and how can we keep it that way?
Well, we just got to not mess it up. We have a lot of really significant advantages in cider. So New York now, there's somewhere around 500 commercial cideries in the United States, and we're somewhere about 90 in New York State. We don't really have a good number because the industry is developing so rapidly. I think I heard there were something like 5 or 6 cideries being licensed every week in New York State. So we definitely have critical mass. We have this fantastic apple industry in New York State that's up until actually 70 years ago, New York was the #1 state in the U.S. for apple production. Now it's the #2 behind Washington. And our industry in New York is very diversified geographically. There are big apple orchards up around Lake Champlain. They're in the Hudson Valley, of course, really from here, actually from north of us, really from Lake George all the way down to Putnam County. There are orchards on both sides of the Hudson River. All around the Finger Lakes, there are orchards, and then the largest production center starts about Oswego and goes all the way across the lakeshore, Lake Ontario, right out to Buffalo. And that industry has been there for hundreds of years. It's quite different culturally. The Hudson Valley industry historically was more for fresh fruit that supplied New York City. So it was kind of like they call New Jersey the Garden State, right? Maybe we should call New York the Big Apple, I guess. The Lake Ontario shore was mostly for processing fruit. So those are a lot of pretty big orchards, 300, 400 acres, some of them. And historically, they grew varieties that were primarily for applesauce or sweet cider or dried slices. Actually, there were a number of drying factories where they'd slice them and dry them. So they were growing apples that were fairly large, that had fairly high sugar content, and that were quite acidic, because that's the chemical profile that you want for processing for juice apples or applesauce apples. And it turns out that's a really critical chemical profile for making hard cider as well. You need the sugar to get the alcohol, you need the acid to sort of balance and to give you microbial stability, the low pH or high acidity. So we have this industry in New York State that doesn't just grow dessert apples like the Fuji's and the Red Delicious and the Macs, but knows how to grow very efficiently in fairly large volume apples like Golden Russet, Northern Spy, Roxbury Russet, Rhode Island Greening, Newtown Pippin, apples that they've been growing for processing historically that now are providing this basis for very high quality ciders. The other advantage that we have in New York State is for example, Central Washington, the Yakima Valley and the Columbia, the Okanagan Valley, where they grow most of their apples there, is actually too hot to grow apples for cider. They can do it using evaporative cooling, which is the water they get from the federal water projects. But apples are a fruit that actually does better. You get better flavor and better fruit quality in a cooler growing season. So this cool climate that we have is really an advantage for us in growing fruit for cider. And then the final thing that we have here is, New York City is kind of the mecca for people who make alcoholic beverages. It's the #1 market for imported wine in North America. And it's a trendsetter for both for food and for beverages. So we've got this pretty educated, very food savvy, what is New York City now, 12 million or 8 million, depending on whether you count the outer boroughs or not. And there it is, we're right next to it. Centrally isolated, we used to say in the Finger Lakes. We are within a couple hundred miles of an 80 million person market. And it's a pretty upscale, educated market of people who are very interested in food and wine and cider. So we've got a lot of things going for us. And I think the final thing that's really made a huge difference is that we have a state government right now that is very supportive of craft beverage. When I travel around the country and give talks to people in other states about cider, and I tell them the things that we can do in New York, things like being able to self-distribute, being able to sell our low-alcohol ciders in grocery stores alongside with the beers, having this local supply of really good cider types, cider varieties. People in other states are just kind of amazed at how good we've got it here.
You're referring to, of course, what's happened in Albany over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
With not only cider, but all the entire farm-based craft sector
Yep.
has received a lot of support.
It really goes back to Mario Cuomo in the late 70s when the New York State grape industry was about to go bankrupt because there were only 1 or 2 wineries that were buying all the grapes, and there were 700 or 800 people growing grapes to sell to the Canandaigua Wine Company. And the prices were getting so low for those grapes that a lot of the growers figured that they either needed to start turning their grapes into wine or they'd be out of business. And the New York State Farm Winery Act was passed in the late 70s that enabled small producers to use their own grapefruit to make estate wines on their farm and then to sell directly to the public. And that was just huge. I mean, we now have 400 some commercial wineries in New York State, and it goes back to Mario Cuomo, and then Andrew Cuomo, I think, has been sort of taken it the next step in the last 5, 6 years. And I think what's happened, and it's others in Albany, I think this is one of the few areas where I think Republicans and Democrats actually can work together, is to promote these diversified local businesses that use agricultural products and turn it into very high value foods and beverages. So it's a
win-win.
It's definitely win-win, and the New York State has really gone out of its way to nurture and to promote this local beverage industry, and it's been quite successful.
Which leads to the fact that there is great value added in the products, but also to benefit the producers, the farmers, the orchardists. Can you talk about how this cider boom is now benefiting the various sectors of the farm beverage?
So we have this fundamental problem in the apple industry everywhere in the world, which is we are getting better and better at growing apples. We can grow more fruit on less acreage, and the quality is more consistent. We have great ways. We have refrigerated storage. We have controlled atmosphere storage. We've developed methods, and a lot of that was developed at Cornell. And so this availability of apples, year-round, high-quality fruit is better than it's ever been. And people are eating a little more fruit than they used to, but basically per capita apple consumption in the world is not increasing fast enough to keep up with our ability to produce volumes of fruit.
They'd have to eat 2 apples a day.
Right. And actually, I think Germany and Austria have the largest apple consumption. The average person eats about 50 pounds of apples per year. In the U.S., we're way down the list there. We're somewhere around 42, 43 pounds per person per year. So we try to get people to eat more fresh fruit. We have all those wonderful slogans about an apple a day, keeping the doctor away. But another way to do that is to turn them into sweet or fermented cider. And because the supply is very good and the demand is increasing slowly but not keeping up with the supply, the price for processing apples has actually it's about the same as it was 30 years ago. Meanwhile, our costs of production have gone up 2 or 3-fold over that same period of time. So the profit margin for growing and selling fresh fruit is just getting narrower and narrower and narrower, and that's why growers are more and more interested in growing Honeycrisp, let's say, which is an apple that people will pay you 2 or 3 times more for per pound than a Mac. And cider is another way to do that. So you take a gallon of sweet, fresh pressed cider, which is the raw product that all good ciders begin with. That's worth maybe $5 in the wholesale market. If you take that gallon of sweet cider and you ferment it, which is it's not an easy thing to do, but it's not that difficult to do either. Now you have a product that's worth somewhere around $50 a gallon. So it's just an enormous increase in the value of what you can do with apples. And since people aren't eating fewer fresh apples, now you have this alternative place to sell your fruit that's really expanding the aggregate demand. So it's been great, and we worry a little bit about what fresh fermented cider consumption has been almost doubling every 2 years since about 2000. That's starting to level off a little bit, but it still is increasing by 10 or 11% per year, which is pretty good for a beverage. And the question is, how long will that keep happening? How can we sustain that? And my feeling is that what we need to do to sustain it is to really diversify and just kind of raise the quality level and the diversity aspects of the cider that we make. So offer people more, get them to appreciate all the different kinds of cider that we can make. And cider with food. Cider is a very, very food-friendly product, especially at the drier end. And so any place where you are drinking wine, you could really be drinking cider.
So you were just hinting at quality ciders, and many of our viewers may see, in the grocery store, mass-produced ciders. How do these craft or quality ciders compare to what you would typically find in a grocery store?
Yeah, so depends on the grocery store. Some grocery stores actually now have very good selections with lots of different ciders, but in general, the world cider market can be divided into sort of 2 sectors. The vast majority of the cider that people consume is what we would call mass market cider. And almost all of that is made from juice concentrate. So that's the stuff you buy when you buy frozen apple juice, and then you dilute it with water and stuff. That's juice concentrate. And that's a global commodity. So actually, next time you buy a can of that, if you ever buy it, take a look at the back and you'll see this concentrate was made from apples that could have come from Argentina or Chile, China, Poland, Hungary, Washington. It literally can come from anywhere around the world. And to make that juice concentrate, you take fresh pressed apple cider and you boil it, basically, and you boil off the water until you get the concentrate's usually about 70% sugar.
It's like an apple reduction.
Exactly. But in the process of doing that, most of the flavors, the aromas that you think of, when you get your first glass of fresh cider in September and you lift it up to your nose, and there's just all those wonderful spices and kind of apple aromas. All that stuff goes out the top of the tank when they're boiling it. The big juice plants actually capture that stuff and distill it, and they'll sell you a little jar of like concentrated apple aroma could be $100 for a pint of this stuff, and it's used by the food industry. If you get apple muffin mix or apple cake mix or something, they'll actually add back these. But from a cider maker's perspective, all the sort of real complex varietal aromatics that you want in a high-end craft cider are gone if that cider is made from juice concentrate. And most mass market cider is made from the beginning raw product is concentrated frozen apple juice. So that accounts in the U.S. probably almost 90% of all the cider that's being consumed is made by about a dozen very large companies, and it's the basis for that is this frozen juice concentrate. At the other end of the spectrum, you have what would be called artisanal, is the term they use in Europe. And that term actually in Europe has a legal definition in France and Spain. And here we usually call it craft. A lot of us lately have been wanting to call it orchard-based cider, meaning that the cider is actually made by somebody that either has an orchard or has access to the orchard, and it starts as fruit, and the fruit gets pressed and then made into cider as all one step, rather than coming in the hold of a ship from the other side of the world as juice concentrate. So the primary difference then between the mass market ciders and the craft ciders is going to be that all the aromatics that you've lost in the juice concentrate, and that, yeah, you could buy the aromatics and add them back in the tank, and they do. But it's not the same.
Cider makers would do that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, they're very aware of the lack of aromatic characteristics. But you can't, the chemicals that give the aromatic profile, it's the same thing as a wine. If you take a Pinot Noir, there are more than 100 aromatic compounds in the Pinot Noir grape. And since you make wine, nobody makes wine from frozen grape juice concentrate, right? I mean, and
people would laugh
why
at
not?
that.
Yeah, they
the
laugh
concept,
at it.
right?
And it's the same thing with apples.
Right.
If you want to have a cider that has all those wonderful flavor components of a fresh apple, if you want that to end up in your cider, you have to start with fruit. You can't buy that in the global commodity market. So that's really the fundamental difference. And then beyond that, tannins, which are polyphenols, it's a kind of group of very complicated molecules that can taste either bitter or astringent or anything in between, depending upon what chemical forms they are. And the tannins in apples are primarily in apples that are produced just for cider. So we have the apples that you buy in the supermarket are mostly dessert apples, what we would call dessert. Most of them are what would be called sweets, so they have a lot of sugar, a little bit of acid, very little tannin, and then of course they do have their aromatics. The apples that people want for craft ciders are what are called bittersweets or bitter sharps, and the bitter part refers to the polyphenol or the tannins content. They just do all kinds of wonderful things for cider. They're antimicrobial, so they give you it's like a natural preservative in a craft cider. They give you color, so that kind of brown, kind of caramelly color, which you can also get by dumping it in caramel sugar. But if you have tannin in the juice, then your cider is naturally going to have some kind of a golden brown hue. They're antioxidants, tannins are, so they're actually for the same reason you want to eat tomatoes and blueberries and purple plums and stuff, because or broccoli, and a lot of fruits and vegetables have antioxidants. And when you eat them, those antioxidants actually protect your DNA from mutation. They're produced by plants to protect themselves against sunlight, actually. And so a cider that has a high tannin content is actually going to be very healthy cider for you to consume. And then a couple other things they do in cider is when you're making cider, you ferment it in a big stainless steel tank at a relatively cold temperature. And for the first couple weeks or month, depending upon the temperature, it's very, if you take off a glass and you look at it, it's really turbid. You can't see through
Cloudy.
it. And it's yeast. That's primarily you're looking at billions and billions of yeast in that. And then at the end of fermentation, when the sugar is all gone and the yeast have done their thing, they run out of food and they all kind of settle down to the bottom of the tank. And at that point we call it the lees. And that settling out and clarification process in cider goes much quicker and cleaner if there are tannins in the cider, because some of those tannins will combine with things that can create those hazes, and they just pull them right down the bottom of the tank.
Interesting. You mentioned bitter sharp and bitter sweet. What's the difference between a bitter sharp and a bitter sweet?
So the bitter part just refers to the tannins, and tannins aren't all bitter. So there's actually, if you talk to a cider maker, they'll say there's hard tannins and soft tannins. And the hard tannins, you get the bitterness on your tongue. The soft tannins are more astringency, so they're not usually as bitter, and you perceive them as a kind of a dryness on your cheeks. It's all the same. The difference actually is the degree of what they call polymerization. Tannins are these ring molecules, and the more you link them together, the bigger the molecule, and the less bitter it will taste, the more astringent it will taste, which is why many red wines are aged. What they're trying to do during the aging process, say with a good Bordeaux, is to get those tannins to cross-link, and so that they're softer and more pleasant, a little less harsh, where sometimes you get a red wine that just kind of gives you cotton mouth.
Yes.
That's a wine that needs aging, and that's tannins.
But bitter sharp and bitter sweet, are they
Just
sweeter and
sharp is
and
malic
tart?
acid, which is tartness, and sweet is sugar. They're all sweet, and actually, some of the bitter sharps are twice as sweet as a Mac or a Golden Delicious. So it's really the amount of malic acid, the acidity, that differentiates them.
Interesting. We have very little time left, but can you tell us a little bit about making cider, and as opposed to is it more like wine or more like beer?
It has almost nothing to do with beer. And if you want to get a cider maker ticked off, just ask them how the brewing process is going. It's very similar to making a white wine. You start with a juice. Actually, a lot of the yeasts that we use in cider are champagne yeasts or white wine yeasts. And the yeast is really important in cider because a lot of the fruit flavors actually come from the yeast that you use in addition to the fruit. And that's another long story, but...
So cider makers will choose their yeasts very carefully.
We choose them very carefully.
To achieve a flavor profile.
Exactly. The yeast is a very important part of that process. And you also, for cider, you want a yeast that ferments very slowly and very cleanly. So you don't want it to produce sulfur aromas so it's think white wine, and you're pretty close to cider. So
I think we can sum this up by saying that cider is really an art. Cider making is an art and science
it is
at the same
indeed.
time.
That's what makes it so interesting and so much fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's been great to have you here, Ian, and I know that our viewers have learned a lot today from you. Thank you so much for
Good.
coming.
Well, thanks for
We appreciate
inviting
it.
me here. It's been a pleasure.
Terrific. Thank you.